Tonight's presentation, Unleaded Avgas, Cure or Curse. A lot of interest in this one. Boy, we have over 3,100 people pre-registered for this. Our presenter is Mike Busch. Mike is president of Savvy Aviation Incorporated. He's authored numerous aviation articles in aviation publications over the years. Mike's a CFI, A&P mechanic with IA rating. He's the FAA's Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year in 2008, a member of EAA and continuing contributor to EAA's weekly webinar series. We're sure to appreciate you, Mike. I hope your voice holds out. I know you're fighting a little cold there, so we wish you the best of luck for a strong voice for the next 90 minutes. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, I think the cold is over. It's just I didn't have much of a voice yesterday, so I was hoping that it would come back. We'll see how it holds out. Let me see if I can grab the screen here. Well, this is sort of an unusual webinar because it's kind of a whodunit, except that we haven't written the last chapter of it yet. So we're sort of going to leave things a little hanging at the end, but it's a very interesting subject, and I wanted to bring everybody up to speed on what we know so far. Probably be a follow-up webinar once we get some more answers. And the subject, of course, is unleaded avgas, and the thing that triggered this was something that happened late last October, and that was that what was probably the largest scale to date test of unleaded avgas at the University of North Dakota flight school up there in Grand Forks was terminated very suddenly after only 4 months. They had switched from 100 low lead to using the Swift UL94, which is an unleaded fuel that's been used quite a bit here in California, because there are a number of airports that where 100 low lead was outlawed by the local authorities, and UL94 was the fuel that was available. So the UND certainly is not the only place that's been using Swift UL94, but this was a pretty massive test. They're very large fleet. I'll get into some of the details of just how big a fleet they have. And they terminated the use of the Swift UL94 very suddenly and returned to 100 low lead after just 4 months. And that took a lot of us by surprise. We were pretty shocked, and we were disappointed that they did that. And we wanted to find out why. And when UND announced that they were going back to 100 low lead, the director of maintenance put out a press release citing that they had evidence of significant exhaust valve seat recession in some of the Lycoming-powered Piper Archers in its training fleet. And director of maintenance went on to say that they were pulling the plug on the Swift 94 UL. Didn't really provide any more information about what significant recession meant, how significant it was. And we now have some more information about that, but not as much as it would be nice to have. So this got a lot of us looking at this whole question of valve recession and whether leaded fuel is required to avoid valve recession, and so on. A couple of weeks ago, we got some more information. The new dean of the UND School of Aerospace Sciences, Dr. Krause, reached out to me and sent me some more specific information that helped quantify the problem a little bit and gave an idea of just what a large test this was. And I'll run over a little some of that information with you right now. This is the latest information that we have. At any rate, the UND fleet, the UND has 1,600 primary flight students, so it's a very big flight school, one of the largest in the country. Their training fleet consists of 76 Piper Archers and 14 Piper Seminole twins, plus 5 Robinson helicopters, which I don't think were part of this. They put on over 100,000 hours a year on these airplanes. In some months, when they're peak flying months, they'll sometimes exceed 13,000 hours per month. And some of their aircraft will fly in excess of 1,200 hours per year. So they fly the heck out of these airplanes. They put a lot of hours on it. They use a lot of fuel, and they're all 4-cylinder Lycoming engines in these Archers and Seminoles. UND originally switched over from 100 low lead fuel to the Swift UL94 in June 2023. They'd planned to do it earlier, but there were some supply chain problems that delayed the onset of the switchover. So they did switch over to using UL94 in June 2023. And as I mentioned, they abruptly terminated that 4 months later and switched back to 100 low lead. During the 4 months that they were running on UL94, they flew 46,000 hours on that fuel and consumed 386,000 gallons of UL94. So it's a pretty active operation. All of these airplanes, as I mentioned, are powered by 4-cylinder Lycomings, O360s in the Archers and IO360s in the Seminoles. Their leaning protocol, they basically run the airplanes full rich, except for cross-country operations. And in cross-country cruise, they operate them at peak EGT, which is apparently what the Piper POH calls for. All of these airplanes are Garmin G1000 equipped, so they log a lot of data, and they have a pretty comprehensive telemetry system where all this data is gathered together in a database where they can do a lot of analysis on it. And again, this is quite a large fleet. So the problem started. Remember that they switched over to the fuel in June of 23, and in late August they had one of their Seminoles. The pilot experienced a vibration, and when he looked at the engine monitor page on the G1000, one of the cylinders on the left engine was showing significantly lower EGT than the others, like 500 degrees lower than the others. So the pilot decided to abort the mission, return to base. And they put the airplane into maintenance. And when they did a borescope inspection on the cylinder that was showing low EGT, they observed severe recession of the exhaust valve seat. They wound up replacing that cylinder and putting the airplane back on the line. Now, valve seat recession occurs when the valve seat, which is an insert that's pressed into the cylinder head, wears away, so that it's so that the valve closes further into the head than normal, and if it wears away far enough, there'll start to be leakage, and the valve will start to burn. Here's a picture of the actual Seminole, what they saw through the borescope when they borescoped the Seminole valve, and you can see it's severely recessed to the point where you can actually see daylight coming through. It's there was almost no seat left. It was a very severe case of valve recession. None of the other cylinders on that engine and none of the cylinders on the other engine on the Seminole exhibited this, just this one cylinder. But it was quite severe. It was pretty obvious why the engine was running rough and had the abnormal EGT indication. So once this happened, they started looking for valve seat recession, and over the next 2 months, they discovered 11 additional cases of valve seat recession. Now, as far as I know, none of them caused operational problems. They didn't discover them because of a rough running engine or anything like that. They discovered them in the course of doing inspections of the aircraft. These aircraft all come in for 100-hour inspections, and of course, if the airplanes are flying 1,000 hours a year, they do a lot of 100-hour inspections in the course of a year. So, at any rate, they found another 11 cases of valve seat recession, presumably much less severe than the one on the Seminole. And as a result of that, they made the decision to return to 100 low lead fuel. They then inspected all 114 Lycoming engines in their fleet. They discovered an additional 9 cases of recession. And again, we don't know how severe the recession was. As far as I know, none of them caused operational problems. Some of them caused some loss of compression, but we don't know how many. So anyway, in total, they found 21 cases of exhaust valve seat recession detected out of the 456 cylinders in their 114 engines in this fleet. And then they said, since returning to 100 low lead, they kept looking, and the number of cases of valve seat recession, they say, have grown to 128. But again, we don't know how much seat wear it took for them to call it a case of valve seat recession. Talk a little bit more about some of the methodology they used to measure recession. They indicated that most of the cylinders in which valve seat recession was detected had more than 400 hours before the recession became detectable, or a compression loss was detected that was attributable to valve seat recession. And then they made the comment that none of the replaced cylinders have exhibited valve seat recession so far, but if I do the math, I don't think any of the cylinders that they replaced have gotten to 400 hours yet. So that may not really mean that much. Any rate, so UND is back on 100 low lead. They're continuing to study data from their G1000s to try to figure out whether they can find any correlation in terms of which engines or in which cylinders had the valve seat recession problem. And they've got a ton of data from the G1000. So they're looking, for example, whether the airplanes that did a lot of cross-country flight with a lean mixture had more or less recession than the airplanes that were used in the practice area and the pattern where they were running pretty much full rich. Another wrinkle that they're looking at is that the airplanes that were on long cross countries would typically have to refuel with 100 low lead while they were away from home, because they could only get the 94 UL typically when they were at home base. So they're trying to see whether there's some correlation there with the recession, that whether the airplanes that refueled with 100 low lead during long cross countries suffered less recession or no recession. And they're also looking to see whether the number of takeoffs and landings, the number of max power cycles on the engine correlated with valve seat recession. That's apparently an ongoing study. Now we were pretty taken aback by this, what UND found here, because there'd been so much testing of unleaded fuel in piston aircraft engines before, and pretty much everything that we'd seen in the past had indicated that switching to unleaded fuel was all positive with no negative. So this was really the first thing that came up that indicated that there might be a problem. We have decades of experience using unleaded automotive fuel in a wide range of low compression aircraft engines, ranging from the O320s like in Cessna 172s to Continental 0470s and Cessna 182s, and basically never really had any problem in using unleaded MOGAS in the low compression engines that qualify for the MOGAS STC. So what came out of UND was very surprising, and everybody started saying, is this a major setback for the transition to unleaded fuel, or is it just a blip? And we don't have all the answers to that yet, but I do want to tell you what we do know, because we do know quite a bit. So a little bit of background on this whole question of valve recession and unleaded fuel. The first experience that people had with this was in the automotive world, because the EPA started the transition to unleaded automotive fuel back in 1974, when they mandated that unleaded fuel be universally available. And the thing that prompted this was that cars started being built with catalytic converters, and the use of leaded fuel in engines would destroy the catalyst and the catalytic converter. So if you had a newer car with catalytic converter, you had to use unleaded fuel or you'd destroy the catalytic converter. And the catalytic converters were first introduced in the 1975 model cars. So the EPA mandated that all gas stations have unleaded fuel available in 1974. And for quite a while, they were selling both leaded and unleaded fuel. And if you had a newer car with a catalytic converter, It had a restricted fuel opening, so you couldn't fuel it, or at least it'd be difficult to fuel it with leaded fuel that would destroy the catalytic converter. In 1996, they completely banned leaded MoGas and switched over totally to unleaded fuel. And when that for on-road vehicles anyway, and when that happened, the problem of valve recession started to show up in older cars that were designed to run on leaded fuel. And it turned out that the cars built in the 60s and earlier tended to have valve seat recession problems when they were forced to switch to unleaded fuel. But later model cars didn't have that problem. And it turned out that the difference had to do with the metallurgy of of the valve seat inserts that they used. The later model cars were built with hardened valve seats, but the earlier model cars either had no valve seat inserts at all and had the valve seat machined right into the cylinder head casting, or else they had valve seat inserts, but they were made out of relatively soft material. And so the engines that had soft seats were suffering quite badly from valve seat recession when they had to switch to unleaded fuel. But the ones with hardened seats didn't have that problem. So the hardness of the seat made a huge difference. So now we're in the process of going through with our piston aircraft engines what the cars had to go through back in the 90s when leaded fuel was removed from the market. And hopefully we've learned some things from the car experience, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So what causes recession? Well, a lot of studies were done when we were going through all of this trauma with automobiles, and there were studies done in university laboratories. Major oil companies published papers on it, and there's really quite a bit of stuff written on it. If you read it all, it gets a little bit confusing because not all of the researchers agreed completely on the causes, and they used a lot of incompatible terminology. But the consensus seemed to be that valve seat recession occurs in two phases. The first phase is where the pressure of the valve face, the sealing surface of the valve, pressing against the valve seat causes what's called micro-welding. This is the same phenomenon that causes friction when metal parts move against one another. But in this case, the pressure of the valve against the seat causes micro-welding between the two surfaces that, when the valve opens again, results in material transfer between the sealing surface of the valve and the sealing surface of the seat. And when there's enough of this micro-welding, eventually those surfaces become rough and abrasive. Here are some pictures of valve face and a valve seat that are affected by micro-welding, and you can kind of visualize the metal transfer that's taken place between the sealing surface of the valve and the sealing surface of the seat. Then once these surfaces have become roughened through this micro-welding process, then the sliding action of the surfaces against one another start to abrade either the valve face or the seat, and usually the seat is the one that wears down. and it basically grinds it down. This is aggravated additionally by if the engine uses exhaust valve rotators, which the majority of piston aircraft engines do. The rotators cause the heat distribution on the valve to be evened around the circumference of the valve, and also help keep the sealing surfaces clean of deposits. But if the sealing surfaces are rough, the rotation of the valve can also cause aggravate valve seat recession. Now, there are two things that affect the micro welding of these two surfaces. The micro welding can occur either at the moment of impact as the valve closes into the seat, or it can occur during the combustion event at the moment of peak pressure, where the high pressure inside the combustion chamber is pressing the valve against the seat. In automobile engines, the impact is significant because they're high revving engines and the valves open and close quite rapidly. In aircraft engines, which rotate quite slowly, the impact is quite modest and probably not a factor in micro welding. It's really the peak combustion pressure pressing the valve against the seat that's responsible for the micro welding. So this peak pressure, which is a thing that causes the problem, is increased by several factors. The higher the compression ratio, the greater the pressure of pressing the valve against the seat. The more aggressive the ignition timing, the higher the peak pressure, and also the lower the fuel octane, the higher the peak pressure. So all three of these things aggravate the problem of micro welding and tend to increase the likelihood of valve seat recession. And as it turns out, these engines in the Piper Archers have all of these negative factors going against them. They're high compression engines, 8.6 to 1 compression ratio. They have very aggressive ignition timing, 25 degrees before top dead center. And then the Swift fuel, which is rated at 94 octane, is a lower octane fuel than what they had been running on before. Lower octane fuel, the flame front propagates more rapidly, and the pressure, the peak pressure occurs. Is basically the pressure curve is peaky, or the peak pressure is higher with lower octane fuel. So these engines had all three of these factors going against them, as it turns out. Now, micro welding can be mitigated in two ways. It can be mitigated chemically, and in the studies that were done in the automotive world, there was some pretty good evidence that lead oxides do inhibit micro welding. Or it can be inhibited metallurgically by making the valve seat out of a hard material that resists micro welding. So that's why the older cars could get away with softer seats, because the lead in the fuel was helping chemically reduce the micro welding, whereas once the transition to unleaded fuel was made, it was important to have hardened valve seats, and the earlier model cars that didn't have hardened valve seats were suffering. So in the aviation world, the same thing. Leaded avgas or hardened valve seats should help minimize micro welding. So then the question is, well, how hard are the seats in our aircraft engines? And as far as we can tell, Lycoming switched to hardened valve seats more than 30 years ago. And so virtually all of the Lycoming cylinders in the field should have hardened valve seats that theoretically should do just fine on unleaded fuel. And Lycoming approves the vast majority of their engines for use on unleaded fuel. In 1989, the FAA did a 150-hour side-by-side test involving a pair of Lycoming 0320 engines running on test stands, one running on 100 low lead, another running on one of the 100 octane unleaded PAFI fuel candidates. And at the end of the 150-hour test, they did very precise measurements and could find absolutely no evidence that there was any increased valve seat recession on the engine that was running on the unleaded fuel. On the other hand, the 0320 was not a high compression engine, and the test was only 150 hours. And what UND was saying was that they weren't really finding valve seat recession in cylinders that had less than 400 hours. So it may be that this test just wasn't long enough and wasn't difficult enough. Lycoming has become an enthusiastic supporter of unleaded fuel. They issued a service instruction in April of 2020, service instruction 1070 Alpha Bravo, which lists basically every engine that Lycoming makes. It's a big giant matrix that lists all the engine models that Lycoming makes and all of the fuels that each engine is approved to run on. And if you look through the service instruction, it turns out that the overwhelming majority of Lycoming engines are approved for both UL94, which is what the Swift makes, and UL91, which is apparently an unleaded avgas available in Europe. And an awful lot of them are also approved for use on premium unleaded automotive fuel. In contrast, Continental is kind of the very opposite. They're very late to the unleaded party. Paul Bertorelli did a really good investigative report in AvWeb some months ago, and according to Paul's research, Continental didn't switch to hardened exhaust valve seats until 2019. So that means that there are probably a lot of Continental cylinders out there that have non-hardened seat inserts that are still in the field. Although all new cylinders that were built since 2019 apparently have hardened seats. Also, Paul's report indicated, interestingly enough, that as recently as 10 years ago, Continental had a very nasty looking warning on their website, warning that the use of unleaded fuel in Continental engines could result in unacceptable exhaust valve seat deterioration in as little as 10 hours, which seems a bit hyperbolic, given the fact that we've got a lot of history of running low compression Continental engines on unleaded MoGas in the field without any problems. They got a lot of Cessna 182s, for example, running MoGas in 0470Rs and S's without any issues, without any valve issues. Continental took that warning down, but they're not. They have not approved the use of unleaded fuel in any of their engines so far. And according to what I heard from GAMI, Continental has so far declined to do any testing or give approval for G100UL, despite the fact that the FAA issued an STC that approves the use of G100UL in virtually all Continental engines and virtually all Lycoming engines. So Lycoming has been very enthusiastic about unleaded fuel, and Continental has been pretty much the opposite. Not sure why that is, but that just seems like an interesting contrast. Prior to obtaining the STC, GAMI performed more than 700 hours of endurance testing involving both Continental and Lycoming engines with no evidence of exhaust valve seat recession running on G100UL. And I imagine by now they've done quite a bit more than that 700 hours. So the bottom line is we really shouldn't expect any problem running unleaded avgas in any engine with hardened exhaust valve seats, which would mean any Lycoming engine pretty much, and any Continental engine with cylinders built in 2019 or later. And there's an awful lot of anecdotal evidence that low compression Continentals, even without the hardened seats, are doing just fine on unleaded MOGAS. So given all of this background, it's a little bit of a head scratcher as to what was going on with UND, and why they ran into this problem. And it's something that leaves us with more questions than answers. And one of the questions is just how significant was the recession that happened at UND, and were they too quick on the trigger to terminate the test or not? Did UND experience a substantial increase in the number of in-flight engine issues? We're really only aware of the one issue with that one cylinder in the Seminole. Did they, experience a substantial increase in the number of burned exhaust valves that were attributed to valve seat recession? Did they experience a significant increase in the number of cylinders that had to be changed? And what were their criteria for when they decided to take a cylinder out of service because of this? And how much downtime of the aircraft did they attribute to these recession problems? We really don't know. None of this has been quantified yet by UND, at least in terms of what they've been willing to share with us. I know they've shared a bunch of data with Lycoming. Lycoming has been quite silent on the subject. I think they're all trying to figure this out. But it kind of leaves a question of how much of this problem that caused UND to terminate its use of the Swift 94 UL was actually actually based on operational disruption versus some sort of a technical measurement. And the second question is, how exactly did UND measure recession? How did they determine what was significant or not? The information that we got from the director of maintenance at UND was that the way they measured valve seat recession was via the measurement of dry tappet clearance, which struck me as a very puzzling way to measure valve seat recession. So let me talk for a minute about dry tappet clearance. Here's kind of what the valve train looks like on the Continental or Lycoming engine. This one looks more like a Lycoming because it's got It's got a mushroom style lifter. But the valve train has a whole bunch of components that are working together, and there's a certain amount of mechanical slop in the system that the hydraulic lifter removes. The thing that's labeled tappet here has a little hydraulic mechanism in it that gets pumped up with engine oil and eliminates the slop or the lash in the system. So there's a measurement called dry tappet clearance, which measures how much slop there is in that system when the lifters have no engine oil in them at all, or are completely bled down, completely flat. And that's apparently the measurement that UND was using to determine valve seat recession. And it strikes me as an unusual way to do it, maybe not a really good way to do it, because dry tappet clearance is a measurement that normally is only done when a cylinder is replaced, and the purpose is to make sure that the amount of slop, mechanical slop in the system, is within the range that the hydraulic lifter can compensate for when it's pumped up with engine oil. If the dry tappet clearance was too large, then it's possible that the valve might not open all the way. If the dry tappet clearance is too small, it's possible that the valve might not close completely. But this is not a very precise measurement. It's kind of a ballpark measurement, and it doesn't have to be very precise. The Lycoming's dry tappet clearance spec, and this is true of Continentals as well, but Lycoming's dry tappet clearance spec is wide enough to drive an 18-wheeler through. Anything between 28 thousandths and 80 thousandths of an inch of slop in the system is acceptable, is within the range. And so we just need to make sure that the slop is somewhere in that very, very broad acceptable range. And the only time that would be likely to get out of tolerance would be when you change a cylinder and change the geometry of the system. And if a mechanic replaces a cylinder and measures the dry tappet clearance and it's outside of this range, which doesn't happen very often because the range is so wide, but if it is outside the range, then the cure is to install an approved undersize or oversize push rod that will bring that slop within that broad acceptable range of dry tappet clearance, so that when the lifter pumps up, it can take all the slop out of the system. So UND's use of this dry tappet clearance as a means to measure valve seat recession strikes me as problematic in several ways. First of all, the things that make up dry tappet clearance, there are a lot of pieces and parts that add up together to determine the slop in the system. Valve seat recession would be only one of those things. And typically they wouldn't have had records of what the dry tappet clearance is for each of those cylinders, because when you install a cylinder, you typically check the dry tappet clearance, make sure it's within the range, but you don't really write down what it was, because you're only interested in making sure it's somewhere in that very broad range. and that you don't have to change the push rod to an oversized or undersized push rod. But in order to measure dry tappet clearance on a cylinder that's in service, you have to make sure that the lifter is completely bled down and that there's no liquid in the lifter at all. That's not an easy thing to do. As one very experienced engine builder told me, he said, "There's really no such thing as a dry tappet. The only way to really ensure it's dry would be to take the lifter body apart, clean it all out with solvent, a volatile solvent, make sure the solvent all dried, and put it all back together. And that's not something that would be likely done while on an engine that's in service. It's only the kind of thing that would be done when a cylinder is being changed. So it's a strange way to do this measurement. Second of all, the fact that UND decided to start measuring dry tappet clearance during 100-hour inspection, something that is not a normal procedure at all, suggests to me that they were actively, looking for problems in this area. Despite, an awful lot of testing in the past by Lycoming and the FAA and so on that indicated that it shouldn't be a problem, and that raises an obvious concern about whether they were looking too hard for this problem. Once they had the one problem with the Seminole, they really started looking at for recession very hard, and it seemed like, based on the chronology that I gave you earlier, the harder they looked, the more problems they found, and it really makes me wonder whether they were just got a little gun shy on this problem, and whether it wasn't operationally significant. It was more something where they just kept looking for it, because it's a certain amount of valve seat recession is probably normal, and there really wasn't any control group to compare with here. So I'm not saying that there was observer bias here or anything, and I'm not saying that the problem wasn't operationally significant, because we really don't know. I'm just raising the question that it might have been. And and UND really wasn't approaching this as a test of the fuel. They have a very large flight school to run, with a very large fleet of aircraft that they have to keep flying, and if they had any suspicion that the UL94 might be problematic, it's kind of understandable why they would stop using it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it was a problem. We just don't know. But assuming that the problem was real, and that UND uncovered a significant operational issue, despite all of the prior experience that suggested that there wasn't any problem running unleaded fuel in these engines. But if it turns out that it was an operational problem, then what do we make of it? How can we account for it? Is this as I said, is this a major setback for GA's transition unleaded fuel, or is it just a blip? And I started looking at this, and as I mentioned, the Piper Archer engines that use the Lycoming 0360 A4M engines, had a lot going against them, really, if you're thinking about the recession issue. They're among Lycoming's highest compression ratio engines, with a compression ratio of 8.6 to 1. I'm not sure that any of the Lycoming certified engines have a higher compression ratio than that. And they use a very aggressive ignition timing of 25 degrees before top dead center, which even before this problem came up, I always thought that was pretty darn aggressive timing. And, for example, the Lycoming originally certified its IO360 engines with 25 degree ignition timing, and they ran into so many problems with high CHTs and detonation issues and so on, that they changed the timing, and they brought it back to 20 degrees before top dead center, which was very, very conservative. They did not make that change on O360s, only on IO360s, and I'm not sure why. But 25 degrees timing is very aggressive, meaning that it increases the peak pressure during the combustion cycle. The compression ratio is very aggressive. And then there's the question of the fuel octane. When I pulled up the type certificate data sheet for the O360A4M engine, which is the engine in the Archer, it says that the minimum octane rating is 100 octane. Now, when I looked a little closer, it turns out that this engine was originally certified for 91, 96 avgas, which is a grade of avgas that hasn't been available for decades. But that was the fuel that it was originally certified for. And then when 91, 96 went away, they changed the type certificate data sheet to say that the minimum octane requirement was 100 octane. But yet the service bulletin 1020 Alpha Bravo says that it's okay to run this engine on UL94 or UL91. So I'm just saying that all of these factors, the lower compression ratio, the high compression ratio, the aggressive timing, and the lower fuel octane, all are aggravating factors that could affect valve seat recession. And these engines had all of those things working against them. So the high compression ratio and the aggressive ignition timing, this engine, for example, would never qualify for the auto fuel STC because the compression ratio is too high. And I was frankly a little surprised that Lycoming approved this engine for 94 octane fuel. Reducing the fuel octane from 100 to 94, which is approved by Lycoming, but it results in even higher peak combustion pressure than when the engine is running on 100 octane fuel. Again, because lower octane fuel burns faster and creates a higher peak pressure. So, somehow it seemed like eliminating the lead and reducing the octane at the same time might have not been the best idea, at least in hindsight. And on the other hand, I suspect that it would have been pretty easy to compensate for that reduced octane by retarding the ignition timing a little bit, the way Lycoming did on on the IO360s. It, you know, that it would have had to get approval from Lycoming to do that because these are certified engines. But it might have been real easy to compensate for that reduction in octane by making the ignition timing a little bit less aggressive. And since Lycoming did that for the IO360, I suspect it could have been done for the O360 without any big issues. But at any rate, we've got a lot of pieces to this puzzle, and we don't have answers to all of them. I'm hoping that it won't be too long before we get to the bottom of all of this and decide exactly what this experience that UND had with the Swift 94 UL, what it means, and how big of an issue it is, and what needs to be done. My suspicion is it would be probably pretty easy to work around the problem, but that's just my guess at this point. And I think there's quite a bit of research going on to find out definitively exactly what the problem was and exactly what needs to be done to solve it. But I'm pretty sure it's soluble. In the meantime, AOPA is running a really interesting test that I've gotten somewhat involved in. They have a Beech 55 Baron that they're using to do a very interesting side-by-side test of leaded versus unleaded fuel. They call it the one airplane, two fuels, and this Baron has a pair of freshly overhauled Continental IO520 engines that is being run on the GAMI G100 UL fuel on the left side and 100 low lead on the right side. And of course, both of these engines are undergoing exactly the same operations and so on. These engines were built with 12 new Superior Millennium cylinders, which presumably have hardened valve seats since they're new. And the plan is to put as many hundreds of hours on this airplane as they possibly can over the next couple of years, and do very, very careful surveillance of both engines. And again, the advantage here compared to what was done at UND is that here we basically have a control engine, and then the G100 UL engine. So we have something to compare against, which I kind of wish we had at UND, but this is going to be a pretty precise test. The Baron is presently at Ada, Oklahoma, because that's the only place that there's an adequate supply of G100 UL fuel at the moment. AOPA's plan is to move it to Frederick, Maryland, in a couple months once the logistics of getting a decent supply of the G100 UL to Frederick has been accomplished. Because when it's in Frederick, they've got more people to fly it, and they should be able to put more time on it faster. AOPA asked my company, Savvy Aviation, to manage the maintenance and data analysis for this project. And so we'll be doing comparative analysis of digital engine monitor data, very frequent and detailed bore scope image analysis of the two engines, laboratory spectrographic oil analysis for both engines. And in addition, because this whole valve recession issue has reared its ugly head at UND, we created a test fixture that allows us to measure valve seat recession very, very precisely to the nearest thousandth of an inch. And it's not dry tappet clearance. We're measuring the valve directly without getting any of the rest of the valve train involved. So it's a very isolated and very precise measure. a valve seat recession. About 2 weeks ago, we took the baseline measurements on both of these engines, and we're going to be remeasuring periodically so that we can keep really close track of valve seat recession in these two engines. See if there's any difference between the engine running on G100 UL and the one that's running on 100 low lead. And since these two fuels have the same octane, where the unleaded fuel is not a lower octane, they should be a very pure and well-controlled test of the effects of removing lead. So stay tuned for the results of the two fuels, Baron, which will be probably publishing articles in AOPA Pilot Magazine from time to time as the test progresses. And stay tuned for more information on what was going on at UND, because I think it probably shouldn't be too long before we have some better answers there. So I just wanted to bring everybody up to date on what we know and what we don't know. And this is like I say, it's like a whodunit without the last chapter being written yet, but it's a very interesting story. So Tim, that's all I have. I can hear my voice starting to give out here.
We'll give you a little bit of a break now then, okay, while we tee up the
but
questions
that was 108 slides. Okay, so
that might be a record, Mike.
I think so.
As is the attendance. We've had a great attendance. I think over 1,600.
Fabulous.
Okay. Let's start in with John's question. Are you seeing valve seat regression in the SavvyAnalysis pool of aircraft?
We've not run into any valve seat recession problems. No, not. But again, you know, we don't measure valve seat recession as a matter of course. We're doing this on the AOPA Baron now, just because the issue has come up. But this is the kind of thing that normally gets measured. So if there was, you know, really gross valve seat recession, like what we saw in that picture I showed you of the Seminole valve, you know, you look at that with a borescope and you say, "Oh my God, what happened there?" That was a just huge recession. But minor valve seat recession, nobody would even notice. It would have to be bad enough to start causing valves to burn, and even in that case, you know, you'd see a valve burn, but unless the valve seat recession was very, very pronounced, nobody would associate it with recession. They just say, "Oh, the valve's burned. We need to do something about that." So, you know, it's really hard to say. This isn't something that is routinely measured by anybody, and so it's kind of hard to answer that question as to how much recession is normal and how much recession before we have to worry about it. None of that is really really something that we know about.
Theodore wonders, besides the timing, compression ratio, and fuel octane, could recession be caused by the UND practice of leaning to peak EGT rather than the more aggressive lean of peak leaning, or just staying rich?
Well, I mean, that's a great question, and you know, if I had to make a wild guess, I would say that operating the engine's lean at peak rather than at peak EGT would certainly reduce peak combustion pressure and would help mitigate valve seat recession. And I mean, that is a good point that you know, that running at peak EGT probably added a little bit to the problem. You know, I think there's just this whole bunch of factors that when you added them all together, you know, resulted in kind of almost a worst case scenario.
Robert wonders, has UND released information on prior valve seat recession
No,
previously in the fleet that we
no,
used under?
they've never. I'm sure they never measured it. Nobody measures it. It's just not something that's done. I mean, that's the sad thing about the UND thing from my standpoint. That from a scientific standpoint, you sort of wish that they said, okay, we'll put half the fleet on UL94 and the other half on Hunter low lead, then we'll be able to compare them, which would be kind of what we're doing with the Baron, but on steroids, because there'd be all of the 114 engines instead of 2 engines. That's not what happened. We didn't have a control in the case of UND. They ran into this problem, and after 4 months, they just said, "Nah, we've had enough of this. We gotta keep our fleet flying. We got to keep our students on track. We just better do the safe thing. Go back to 100 low lead."
Jim wonders, when the FAA ran their test comparing the two fuels, were the engines run at peak EGT during those tests?
I have absolutely no clue. And those tests were run a long time ago. But again, it probably wouldn't have mattered because those weren't high compression engines. It was, they just didn't, and they weren't run for 500 hours. They were only run for 150 hours. So, again, these UND engines had a whole bunch of factors, all of which, when added together, apparently created a problem. And the important thing is to understand what those factors are, what can be done to mitigate them. And I suspect it would not be hard to avoid the problem that UND had once the situation is analyzed.
Jeff wonders, can exhaust valves be lapped if micro-welding is suspected?
Sure. Absolutely.
And Jim wonders, are the AOPA testing being run at Lena Peak?
I'm pretty sure that those engines are run Lena Peak and cruise most of the time.
Harry wonders, were metallurgical tests done on the severely damaged seats to determine if it was adequately produced?
That's a wonderful question, and my guess is that they were, but nobody's talking. Basically, UND sent the cylinders that they removed due to recession back to Lycoming, and Lycoming isn't talking so far, so we really don't know. There certainly is a possibility that valves, the valve seat inserts were non-conforming as from a metallurgy standpoint. I don't have any reason to suspect that, but it's always a possibility. It's just we don't have an answer to that question.
Ken wonders, do you know, does Superior use hardened valves, exhaust valve seats?
I haven't talked to Superior. I expect that they do, because I'm guessing they're using the same supplier that Continental is, but I don't know that. I could find out. I probably should call my spies at Superior and ask the question.
Paul wonders, since Rotax engines use approved for operation on 91 UL mogas, is there any record of recession on these Rotax engines?
I don't have enough experience with Rotax engines to know the answer to that, except my guess is if there was a problem, we would know about it. So I suspect that there's not a problem with them.
Rob wonders, has this valve issue been noticed at all with the GAMI fuel tests?
As far as I know, absolutely not. I know GAMI's done, but has looked at this very closely during their endurance testing, and and didn't run into any problem.
Mm-hmm. Marvin wonders, the Swift fuel, is there an additive that could be added to mitigate the problem by an additive in the fuel?
I know that there have been some fuel chemistry things that have been experimented with to provide kind of the same chemical mitigation effect that lead oxide has in the automotive world. I don't know whether any of that chemistry is used in any of the unleaded aviation fuels. I just don't know the answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, unfortunately, as I said at the beginning, and through there's a lot of unanswered questions here, this whole UND thing has caused a lot of people to start looking for answers, and we have some answers, but we don't have all the answers yet.
Darren wonders, has Swift Fuels provided any sort of a response to the UND findings?
I'm not aware that they have issued any kind of public statement on the subject. We're sort of hoping that Swift would say something or Lycoming would say something, but so far I think they're still studying it.
Comment from Phil Lockwood. We've been running the Swift 94 UL fuel at Lockwood Aviation in Sebring for more than 7 years in all of their Rotax engines. They run this fuel. Mm-hmm. And we've run a number of Rotax 9 series engines from new to overhaul at 2000 and not seen any valve seat issues. Just wanted to give that as a data point from Lockwood on Rotax engines.
Thank you, Phil.
They do very well on Swift UL94, Phil says.
Yeah. Well, and like I said, they're using tons of UL94 at the 3 or 4 airports in California where 100 low lead has been removed, and everything that I've heard is that they haven't run into any problems either. This is why the UND experiences seems like such an outlier compared to all of the other experiences we've had with unleaded fuel, which have been pretty uniformly positive.
Richard wonders, are intake valves susceptible to recession issues?
Not that I've ever heard of.
And William just wonders, were those engines fuel injected or carbureted, and would that matter?
The engines in the Piper Archers are carbureted. The engines in the Seminole were fuel injected. I think they both had comparable compression ratios. I think they both were timed at 25 degrees.
Mm-hmm. Let's see here.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm not sure about the Seminole engine. It's possible the Seminole engine might not have been a 25. Have to check.
Mm-hmm. Stephen wonders, are the Baron engines used for testing the GAMI fuel turbocharged?
No, they're normally aspirated. The AOPA Baron is normally aspirated engines.
Mm-hmm.
And all the UND engines were normally aspirated engines as well.
Mm-hmm. All right, Mike, well, we're kind of wrapping it up here. So why don't you go ahead and take a minute and share closing thoughts with everybody?
Okay, well, my first closing thought is hopefully we'll be able to do a follow-up once we have some more answers and tie a ribbon on this whole thing. But right now it's just a little bit up in the air. But because so many people are concerned about this, I wanted to bring everybody up to speed on what we know about this whole thing. As usual, if you're not on my email list or monthly newsletter and other good things that we send out, the easiest way to get on our mailing list if you're in North America is to just text the word Savvy, SAVVY, to 33777, and a little text bot will ask you for your name and email address and put you on the list. If you're not in North America, then the easiest way is to go to the Savvy Aviation website and to click the link up at the very top of the homepage to get onto the newsletter list. Or if you around for the post-webinar survey that Tim is going to put up, there's a checkbox on the survey also. If you check it, we'll put you on the list. My 4 books are available at Spruce, EAA Bookstore, Amazon. I need to update this slide. The first 3 of the books now are available as audiobooks. The Airplane Ownership Volume 1 audiobook actually became available in late February. So that's probably happened since my last webinar. So I need to update that slide, and we are working on Airplane Ownership Volume 2 audiobook, and that should be available in a couple months, hopefully. And we're doing the Ask the A&Ps podcast twice a month, and it's a call-in show. So if you have a question, stump the A&P question that you'd like to have us deal with on the podcast, email podcast@aopa.org. Our producer Ian Twombly will schedule you for one of the recording sessions, and we'll get you on the show. We will have a lot of fun with you and try to answer your question. And finally, the next 3 of my webinars, first Wednesday of the month webinars. April webinar is called Ending the War on Jugs, talking about how we can remediate a lot of problems with cylinders without removing them. We think there's a way too frequent cylinder removal going on. A lot of mechanics who are kind of have itchy trigger fingers when it comes to pulling jugs, and there's several methods that we have of solving common problems with cylinders that don't involve removing them. So if you can solve a problem without removing a cylinder, it's always better than removing the cylinder. The May webinar is talking about Savvy's borescope initiative. We've done a lot of, I think, pretty innovative stuff to try to help promote the use of borescope inspections of cylinders. We've got a training video for A&Ps and interested aircraft owners, and we've got a borescope image repository now that's part of the Savvy platform. It's available to anybody who wants to use it. It's available for free and has some really nice capabilities. So I'll be talking about all that stuff in May. And finally, the June webinar is called Minimally Invasive, and talking about how we should be trying to use minimally invasive procedures for correcting problems with our airplanes rather than taking stuff apart that doesn't need to be taken apart. So those are the next 3 webinars, and that's about all I have for tonight. Tim?
Well, thank you very much, Mike. This has been a very insightful presentation. Sure do thank you for giving us this update and insight into this issue. And looks like we had about 1,700 people tuned in tonight.
Oh,
So yeah,
nice.
so thank you all for joining us, and appreciate you tuning in, and hope you can join us next week. Have a great night, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Night.